Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University, Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I would like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. Mark Scerbo. Mark serves as a professor of psychology and human factors at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. He also serves as the editor-in-chief for the journal Simulation and Healthcare. Today, we are going to talk about how human factors and simulation are linked, as well as Mark's role at the journal and its future. Mark, it's an honor to interview you today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's certainly a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you and have an opportunity to chat with you about simulation, healthcare simulation, and maybe we'll even touch on some of the work that you've done.
So tell me, I always like to hear a little bit about the background about how people get involved in sim. And certainly there's probably a natural link between your human factors work and simulation, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Let me begin by saying I am a human factors psychologist by profession. And for those who are not familiar with it, human factors is sort of a synthesis of psychology and engineering. It's a discipline concerned with how to create a better fit between humans and their technology. And I have, well over 30 years of experience researching and designing systems that improve human performance in academic, military, and industrial work environments. Most of my work has involved simulation to some extent. Anytime you're doing laboratory work, you're essentially using a proximity, an abstract task, or something more concrete to do your research. So I've been working with simulation for my entire research career and professional career. When I graduated with my doctorate, I worked for AT&T back in the days when there was only one telephone company, and I worked there for about 3 years with their systems that support the employees, not necessarily the commercial products, but the products that the employees had to use to manage the system. At that time, AT&T's long-distance network was comprised of over 500 computer systems to manage the volume of calls. But what happened is they broke up the phone company. There was a lot of competition coming up. And most people don't remember this, but the judicial decree that broke up AT&T tied their hands behind their back for about 5 years to give the smaller phone companies opportunity to catch up, because they felt, on a level playing field, AT&T would destroy them. So what happened is the other companies did pretty darn well, and it almost drove AT&T out of business. In fact, most people forget this, but they were actually sold and bought by Singular, and Singular adopted the logo and the name, but they actually went out of business as a consequence of the breaking up the phone company. So to make a long story short, that was not a fun environment to work in. And I transitioned, took a job at Old Dominion University, and most of my initial career was studying aviation safety. And in particular, what I was interested in was what happens when the pilot doesn't have anything to do. So they put the plane on autopilot and they fly from New York to London. There's not a lot to do when you're over the Atlantic Ocean. So what happens in cases of underload, when there isn't much for the pilot to do? How susceptible are they to being able to detect things when they come up, because they're just not engaged with the task? So I did that work for about 10 years. We built a biocybernetic system that actually read EEG signals and monitored their performance in real time with a simulated cockpit. And we were able to show that if you increase the workload, you can get them re-engaged. If you decrease the workload, the stress level reduces itself. So it was a really interesting project, but in terms of brain processing speed, it was, light years. I mean, calendar months of, reaction time. It just wasn't fast enough to be able to really capture what the brain was doing. The other thing is it never was able to, these systems were not able to judge somebody's intent. So you could have very active brain waves, and I have no idea whether they're active because you're engaged in the task or you've got a, interesting daydream going on. That it can't decipher. At about that point in time, our local medical school, Eastern Virginia Medical School, had bought their first virtual reality simulators. And this is like the early 2000s. And I remember being asked if we could help them see if they're any good. And the specific marching orders that I was given was that these things cost a lot of money. Before we start buying more of them, we want to see if they actually work. So we came over and we did a physical and functional analysis of one of the virtual reality simulators, and then ran people through a test. And to make a long story short, we found out that this was really not very well designed. And by doing a task analysis of what the actual clinical procedure involved and comparing it to what the simulator could and could not do, we were able to show where the weak spots are and why this, if you trained on the simulator, you didn't do a very good job. Well, they were very thrilled with that and said, maybe we can have you work with some of the other simulators, of which they had 2 others. I kind of chuckled to myself after having worked in aviation safety for the last 10 years. I said, that's all there is? What do you practice on? And I got, the adage, well, we practice on who comes through the door. When, having worked in, aviation safety for 10 years, I said, oh, that can't be good. Now, in my profession, there was not a lot of activity in healthcare and human factors at about that point in time. Most of healthcare human factors was tied to occupational therapy or physical therapy. There just wasn't a lot of cross-pollination between what my profession does and the way it works in military avenues or aviation or air traffic control and healthcare at that time. So this is early 2000s, and I started, publishing papers saying, there's this whole area of healthcare that we're ignoring. We have all this expertise on safety and how to design reasonable evaluations of technology and simulation systems, and nobody's helping these folks. Maybe I should be doing that. And unlike aviation, where I can make a conscious decision about whether I will or will not get on a commercial aircraft, I don't know if I'm ever going to show up in somebody's emergency room. So maybe it's probably a good act of self-preservation to see that these folks are doing the best they can, and if I can help them. So about the mid-2000s, I started shifting my academic career and research interests from aviation safety strictly to healthcare, and I've been working in that area almost exclusively ever since.
We often use the aviation industry as an analogy to healthcare. And it's interesting because I never thought about that downtime. I wish we had that downtime because everything's moving so fast when you're on. There are occasions, I think, in the nighttime, maybe when there's some downtime, but not often. I think if you ask the lay public, would you feel safer getting on an airplane, or would you feel safer going to the hospital to get admitted for something? You would think that, I would think that most people would feel more comfortable going to the hospital because, they trust their doctors and nurses and all that. And there's some, lack of control when you're on an airplane. I suppose there's some in the hospital as well. But, me as a layperson would have always thought, I was never a good flyer and I'd feel like I should be safer in the hospital. But when you actually look at the numbers, the National Transportation Safety Board estimates your chances of dying in a crash on an airplane about 1 in 29 million. So, and the chances of having an adverse event in the hospital contribute to, death. And half of these are preventable, but the chances of an adverse event is about 1 in 300, 1 in 333-ish. So the numbers are astounding.
Oh, yeah. To comment on 2 of the thoughts you raised there, first of all, I think the average person feels like if they're going to the hospital, they're going to the best place in the world they could be for somebody to look out for their care. That's not necessarily, Southwest last week or the aviation industry. However, the entire national airspace is managed, not only in the United States, but around the globe. And it's managed from the time you get to that aircraft, to basically to the terminal, to the time you leave the terminal. I mean, between the TSA and the FDA and all the things that go into it, they can manage it and they can maintain a level of safety that's unparalleled. You have far greater chance of being injured on the highway than you do in an aircraft. We don't manage healthcare that way, and that's part of the problems. It's also, to be fair to the folks that work in healthcare, it is far more complex than getting a plane up in the air and bringing it down. Yes, there are a lot of things that can go wrong, but actually we've worked out most of the problems for air travel, and that's why it's safe as it is. We haven't worked out many of those problems for human beings yet. In fact, we don't really even know if we've defined at a molecular or submolecular level just what we are yet.
I totally agree. But I think we've worked out a lot of those problems for aircrafts because we made it a priority. And I really feel that, when we're looking at these adverse event numbers in hospital and we're seeing that over half of them are preventable, if we know they're preventable, then there should be a human system to prevent it from happening. And that's, of course, where simulation comes in. I was always taught make the easiest thing to do the safest thing to do, and that's where your profession
absolutely. Basic human tenet is the path of least resistance. People will do the least amount of effort to get things done. So whatever they can do that facilitates what the ultimate goal is, that makes it easier for them to do rather than cumbersome, they will do it.
So tell me a little bit more about your research looking at the VR simulators, because in our sim lab, we always are looking at that technology, and we haven't fully adopted it to the level where we could, because we just don't feel it's there yet. There's no haptic feedback that's realistic yet. It can immerse you in an environment, but to me, that's about it.
In terms of technological creation of systems that stimulate the auditory and visual system, we can do a pretty good job. All right. When it starts to get to the haptic system, that is a little bit more challenging, and we won't even have to go into olfaction. I mean, there are folks that work with that, but that is even far more challenging. But with haptics, if you get a 6 or 7 degree of freedom system, that still doesn't allow you to do simple things like, for example, 6 degree of freedom systems allow for simultaneous push, pull, and twisting movements, but not for squeezing and not for all fingers. When you can't do that on a virtual system, you have to unlearn what you have learned to do naturally to work with the virtual system. And that's why a lot of folks are uninterested in using them at this stage. To get a novice who's never done something before to a point where they can do it reasonably well, I think VR is okay. But if you bring in experts who know how to do a particular procedure and have done hundreds, if not thousands of them, to work with even the top virtual systems, they will point out the weaknesses immediately.
Maybe medicine changes first, because this parallels the resistance a lot of my surgical friends have using the Da Vinci robot, is that they claim that, the haptics, the feel of the tissue really helps them differentiate normal and abnormal and assists in their operation. If we have a generation of surgeons that are used to operating with a Da Vinci, maybe then virtual reality training can get you there a little more effectively.
Sure. The goal is, do you try and, adapt the human for what the technology can and cannot do, or do you change the technology and get it to adapt to what the human is good at doing? I mean, those are decisions that are made from what is technologically feasible to what is actually cost effective.
So money drives the answer.
Yeah. I mean, if you can build a system that faithfully replicates what the haptic sensation would be for a given procedure, it would probably have to be targeted for that procedure. Then the question for anybody who builds that system is, can I sell enough of them to recoup my investment?
Right. Because as we know, these systems aren't cheap. And that's why we haven't put a full force investment into them, because, I do agree. It can help with the novice, at least get you in the door and get you to the next level. And then, but then you really need the haptics, and even the haptics aren't quite there, even for the best simulators. If we talk about a more simple procedure like a central line insertion, the haptics aren't quite there on those simulators either, compared to what a real human tissue feels like. And if we can get closer to that.
Well, another approach to simulation is in aviation, they have 4 classifications of simulator. I mean, you don't practice in the Boeing 777 simulator unless you've been flying for an extended period of time and you're going to train to fly that particular aircraft. That's not open to the novices. So there are a range of simulators, class 1 through class 4, that you can train on. And most people don't realize it, but the reason the flight simulator was created in the first place, it was to protect the aircraft. It was to save wear and tear on the aircraft from taking novices up there and land them too hard. So they put them in there and said, let's get over the rough spots, on something on the desktop, or that we can do in a room like that, and then we'll migrate them to the aircraft. So there's nothing wrong with having what I would say lower fidelity simulators to get people up to a certain level of skill before you migrate them to something that's a little more realistic. So, the FLS program for surgery is that kind of thing. These are very abstract tasks, but if you can do them in these abstract environments, when you migrate to something that's more realistic, or to tissue, as you've said, whether it's cadaver or, a genuine procedure, you're better off than if you just started with no practice at all. And then there's not to say you couldn't have somebody create a simulator that has the epitome, the apex of haptic fidelity, but you travel to that center because there aren't many of them. That's where you go to learn that procedure and be able to train with that particular simulator. The question is, are you going to do it for a common procedure, or are you going to do it for a challenging procedure where you really do need haptics to learn how to do that to be successful in the procedure from the patient's perspective?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the problem in medicine is we're finding we need to do it for both, right? Because just your FLS example, I was struck by a paper of experienced surgeons that never had to train with fundamentals of laparoscopic surgery as part of their board requirement. And when they went back, a lot of them couldn't pass the test, and they had been performing laparoscopic surgery. And that was a day where, the initial training, lap chole training, was done on animals back in the day. And you'd have to fly into an area to get specific training. And, some of these skills like tying a knot intracorporally is incredibly complex. I have trouble just cutting my hair in the mirror, and I always miss it with the scissors. So imagine looking at a 2D screen and then trying to do some of these tasks in a body, and we find it's much more complicated. This is every day, and I would hope that an experienced surgeon could go back and pass FLS with skill.
Well, if you've been working with genuine patients and you go back and with this task, you'll find these tasks don't faithfully represent how you handle real genuine tissue. We did a fascinating study. We got an ARC grant to look at mental workload and actually spare attentional capacity for training laparoscopic surgery. And what we did is we trained a number of there were physician's assistant students to meet the FLS criteria for knot tying. And then we transferred them to a lightly embalmed cadaver. And you would be amazed at how challenging it was to having passed those criteria for FLS and actually be dealing with real or close to real tissue and the way it behaves. In a study we published in Surgery, we found there was a 3-fold increase in completion time and a 3-fold decrease in spare attentional capacity for intracorporeal knot tying when transferring from FLS to cadavers.
But you would think you could go back the opposite way. You would think that the experienced surgeons I would think at least, that the experienced surgeons would fly through FLS.
It depends on what tasks you ask them to do. And it may be that the experienced surgeons are not doing some of these things as often as they ought to be doing. A lot of the real top experienced surgeons have left some of the menial tasks to the residents. And they're really supervising some of the procedures at this point.
That also is a little scary, though, right? If you can't do it yourself, we'll have the resident do it. But we do see that.
A lot of these tasks that are very, very, require a lot of skill and practice to get good at, often require a lot of skill and practice to maintain your level of performance. So that if you're not constantly doing it, if you take, 6 months off for whatever reason, you've gone on sabbatical, you don't do that, you come back to it, you need to do refresher training. And I'm sure most surgeons are not doing the refresher training with a box trainer.
Well, so this is why we need an FAA for medicine, right? How often are pilots required to do refresher training, and they're still flying?
If I'm not mistaken, I think it's twice a year.
Yeah, every 6 months is at a minimum. So why don't we have that for medicine?
They also have mandatory retirement, which we don't have for medicine. The retirement standard for pilots in single pilot air transport operations is 60 years, and the limit for multi-pilot operations is 65 years. Also, the FAA requires airline pilots to undergo a medical exam to determine their mental health and fitness to fly. It's every 6 months to every 5 years. It depends on the type of flying they do and their age. The FAA also requires pilots in command to have their flight logs reviewed every 2 years.
It's so cliche now to just talk about airlines, but it's just so important. And, everyone claims, well, medicine's so much more complex and there's so moving parts. But then you bring up this almost counterpoint that, it's because they figured everything out. Let's segue into talking about your work at the journal. I always find it interesting because, I've had some involvement with other journals as a associate editor. And I was always in awe about the amount of work and effort it takes to be editor-in-chief. So tell me a little bit about your interest in becoming the editor-in-chief and how that story came down.
Sure. Well, let's go back to the history of the journal. At the time the society was formed, there was really interest pretty early on in establishing a scholarly publication to archive the research of the folks that were doing. And I put my name in it, but human factors person did not look like the kind of person they wanted on the masthead when they were starting. But I was invited to do the average review of an article here and there. And my approach about understanding the technology and the rigor of good experimental design proved to be invaluable. And within a short period of time, they asked me to join the editorial board. And after that, a short period, they asked me to be associate editor. And, we hope David Gaba would continue forever. But, you do get tired of things. You want to move on with your life. And when he finally decided his time was up, they had an open call for, anybody who wanted to submit an application to be the editor. And David kind of encouraged all of the associate editors to put their hat in the ring because, we'd been doing a lot of the work all along. And I had a call with him before I submitted my application. I said, I'm sure this takes a lot of time. And I said, I have to be at a point in my life, in my career, where I can take the time away from my own research because I will be focused on everybody else's research in this community. So I'm willing to do that, but I have to understand what the trade-off is going to be. So I think he painted a pretty realistic picture of the time commitment until I took over. And at that point, when they actually offered the position to me, the number of manuscripts coming in have been just started to increase and increases. Like it has been, there are a couple of years where the number of manuscripts we have, it's been all consuming. I mean, on the one hand, that's a good problem to have. It means people really want to publish in the journal, but it has also meant that we editors and the editorial board have had to take a stronger look at what we think is really newsworthy. And, we have to reject a certain amount of papers. And the more papers that come in, unfortunately, the more papers will be rejected. But, I always throw the question back out to my associate editors. I said, are you comfortable with what we're accepting? Or are you comfortable with what we're rejecting? And uniformly, they agree. People have been using it, training with it, and doing research with this for almost 20 years, even though the journal only, started publishing it in 2006. But there's a lot of stuff we feel like we don't have to publish anymore. And then there are a lot of other topics that we feel like we'd like to see more of. So when we were first starting out, it was really important to publish papers that said that people learned from this type of technology, or I should say this alternative format to pedagogy. They learned from it. They liked it. They appreciated. They felt more comfortable. Those were important things to hear from the folks you were going to ask to go through that training. You move the clock ahead 18, 20 years, and you ask anybody now, would you rather spend an hour in the sim session or would you rather have me talk to you for an hour? What do you think they're going to say? Of course. So we know that people enjoy this. Trainees enjoy this activity. They learn a lot from it. They like it. But in terms of what we want to publish, we feel like we need to move on from things that are seen as being worthwhile to things that actually move the needle in terms of training efficacy and or patient safety. So if you're going to publish a paper that says people learned from this, we really would like to see how did they learn compared to something else? And rather than the standard of doing, essentially nothing, or the standard of something else that's almost on paper intuitive that simulation would be better. How do two forms of simulation training compare? We started the conversation talking about virtual reality. If you have a good matchup between a virtual system and a physical system, then how do they compare? And what are the benefits of training? And maybe you need a blended approach that you do this with a physical system and this with the VR system. Well, that's where we should be now. And then ultimately where we want to be is how does that actually affect what you do with the patient? Now, you would think after all this time, we've got a wealth of information that shows how effective simulation is in translating from the sim center to patient care. We're still looking for studies that are conducted in a way that's rigorous and we can feel confident that they're valid in making claims when they go from the sim center to genuine patient care. And I understand it's hard to do that. You have a lot of autonomy in your sim center. The minute you go into the hospital system, you want to talk to a real patient or do something weird, that's a whole different ballgame. So the playing field is different. But we still would like to have the research that says that after having invested this many hours in training it here, here's the benefit. And there are studies. I mean, clearly you're familiar with some of them. You've done some wonderful work in that area, but medicine is incredibly broad. If you've shown that this type of simulation training is effective for one procedure, what is it about the other, 600 procedures that a surgeon can do, let alone what other procedures an emergency medicine doc will do, or an OB-GYN will do? I mean, we really have just barely scratched the surface of showing translational benefits from the sim center to actual patient care, at least in a scholarly way that, as an editor, I would say, here is the magnitude of effect you can get when you translate from the sim center to a genuine patient, and this is what you should be banking on. And we're there in some places, but not as far along as I'd like to be.
And we don't have these multi-center trials with very large numbers as well, which, in a previous podcast, I was discussing with Paul Frampus about the need for some of these larger studies, because we were talking about, why do hospital systems also not get it? Why aren't they all adopting SIM to train everybody, since it's so effective? And one of his thoughts was that we don't have enough data to really force that needle. And there is data, obviously, but we need some of those larger studies. And then we talked a little bit about the need for a research consortium that is effective in publishing these translational science pieces showing SIM is effective.
And you need a place that will pay for that. It would be hard to ask the hospital system to pay for that. Aviation got to where it is because there's a huge amount of money in the government that wants to ensure safety so that people will get on a plane and they can have this industry. They haven't had to do it for medicine. You've got to have some people in government or establish an agency that's willing to fund the kind of research and the multi-center trials that you're talking about and make it cost effective to do that research and publish those types of studies. They exist, for tiny little things here and there. There was a time when we were having these meetings for trying to get Congress involved in coming up with money to support this effort. And I had, suggested way back when, is that why don't we have a grand challenge like we had for the space race? Let's get a man on the moon by the end of the decade, is what Kennedy said. Why don't we say our grand challenge is to cut, preventable errors by 50% by such and such, and then put the money behind it to really do it? I don't think that's a something that, whether you're, a red state or blue state person, the people in your state, your constituency, would like to know when they go to hospital, their chances of being harmed are going to be significantly less because you helped make that happen. But we don't have anybody interested, at least at the highest levels of government, in establishing that grand challenge.
I think there needs to be more of an outcrying from the public in general. There's still this lack of awareness about the low safety levels in hospitals, or at least, I don't want to say low safety levels. Hospitals are safe. They're not as safe as they can be, right?
Correct.
Or should be. As we know, we shouldn't have 1 in 333 people dying from an adverse event in a hospital. That's just ludicrous. That's just outright. But I'm going to challenge your comment a little more, is why shouldn't the hospitals pay for some of this? Not necessarily the research. The research can be done by the university folk, but at least to support the simulation training in and of itself. There's already plenty of data in my mind that there is a return on investment, especially if you reduce complications. And maybe, I don't know, maybe they need that large randomized controlled trial before they believe it. But, when you show it in one institution, you would think that others would adopt it a little bit faster. For instance, like in our own institution, our hospital is a lot better than they ever have been about using simulation and, in fact, mastery learning to train other personnel, not just residents, but also we're now training attendings and we're training nurses using that. We're even training patients for self-care tasks on that. So, maybe it's because the data is locally that they're seeing, but what is it going to take to get the hospitals to eventually get it? And of course, we need a huge, much more investment from the government in this, I would say, life-saving technology.
I don't disagree with what you say. I think the hospital systems they have and will continue to play a part in it. But hospital profits margins are, they're not huge. And they don't really, every time they make a decision about where to invest X amount of $1 million? Is it going to be to buy another robot that the public wants, or is public safety, that they don't even know about? Paul Frampus, as you mentioned, has been really good about understanding that you've got to get the management and the leadership in hospital systems to really appreciate what we're doing, so that they're, on your side, they're on our side, they're sympathetic to what it is we're doing. And that's still a challenge too. So you asked about the kinds of things we'd like to see in the journal. We still don't get many return on investment papers that are rigorous enough to say, hey, look, here's the real cost savings that we got for this. We get a fair number of submissions, but boy, I'd like to have more. They said, hey, look, we did a thorough and exhaustive attempt to code how much this is going to cost to train people and what it's going to save when we get out of the sim center into the hospital system. We'd love to publish more of those across a variety of different areas, because they make a stronger case.
It's been almost, I can't even do the math in my head, 17 years since the journal started, and at least almost 23 years since the Institute of Medicine put out their landmark book on how unsafe hospitals are. And they mentioned simulation as one of the modalities to make things safer. And how far has the needle moved over that time is the question.
I teach a course in patient safety, a doctoral seminar to human factors students and healthcare students in my institution. And I can tell you from the last set of articles we reviewed the last time I taught, we haven't moved the needle. In fact, if they're keeping better records, we're not doing as well as we did in 2000. Either they're keeping better records, or they're measuring things better, or we're going in the wrong direction. But there are still, the breadth of problems that exist, and in some cases, the places where simulation really hasn't even tapped into it. If you look at diagnostic reasoning, that is a major source of error in the healthcare system, and there are not a lot of papers coming into my journal that address diagnostic reasoning.
As you know, it's incredibly difficult.
Of course it is.
But we are working on a mastery learning curriculum for clinical reasoning, decision making, and so far so good. We'll see what happens, but we'll see if it moves the needle as far as outcomes. We're going to be looking at adverse events afterwards, but it's going to be really hard to show that because they're rare, and you need a big N to show a difference. So we'll see if we can get that in one system, but probably can in multiple systems. You recently published something in the journal about the future effort, and congratulations, by the way, on the steadily rising impact factor. That's really cool to see.
That's attributable to the fine editorial board we have here and the authors who want to send their best work to this journal.
You also talked about some other areas for expansion, and in particular, it was your digital reach and your social media platform. Can you tell how you think that's contributed to everything?
Well, we're really just getting started, and it will ramp up a lot this year. There's a big change that I'll be the first to say here in this podcast, is that we'll be introducing visual abstracts. That has to be coordinated at the publisher end, and all the different mechanisms that have to go into place have already been put there. So we think within the next couple of months, within the next issue or two, we'll be inviting authors who have accepted papers to submit visual abstracts, which will be searchable when you search on keywords. They will pop up when you look at the articles. When it shows up in the table of contents of what's being published in the journal, you'll be able to see the visual abstracts. So that's something that we're adding. In addition, the social media effort is really to drive more interest in what it is that we're doing. I will be honest that we've been at it for a couple of months, and most of the people that have been engaged have been the authors and maybe some readers. But we really went into this with the idea that we want to start to attract people to look at what we're publishing outside of our community. The idea to focus on gun violence and the 10th anniversary of Sandy Hook was to say, hey, look, these are important issues that unfortunately we now have to consider in healthcare settings about how do you handle a mass casualty gunshot event. And while we're putting that issue together, 7 people in my local Walmart were shot. So, it's pervasive. Every time you read one of these articles or these stories you hear on the news, you think, well, that's another community. I feel sorry for them. But it's going to show up in your community at some point, which means the healthcare providers have to be trained for it, not only to be able to handle it, but the repercussions of having to deal with that kind of tragedy are, enormous. And these articles kind of got at, what do you do when you're talking about children? Connecticut or Uvalde. I mean, with the children that are involved, it's just an enormous, tragical event that, unless you're embedded in it, you can't really appreciate how life-changing that is for everybody involved. And we wanted to bring light to this and get people to understand that the simulation community needs to be, first of all, prepare for the kinds of, events when they do occur, but be able to manage, how to handle their own staff when the violence migrates into the hospital borders, or how you train people. What is the best way as a pediatrician to advise somebody about how to train children to deal with these kinds of events? These are questions that 10 years ago we didn't think we'd even have to ask, and yet sadly now we do. But to the extent that we're smart enough to ask them now and think about them and perhaps come up with ideas about training or alternative ways of doing things before the event happens is fantastic. Our state, unfortunately, has a bad history of large mass casualty events. We had a terrible shooting at Virginia Tech. The Virginia Tech mass shooting occurred on April 16th, 2007, and resulted in 32 victims. However, what most people do not realize is that all of the people injured in that shooting who were still alive when law enforcement reached them survived. The campus police had an emergency response team, including a medic, that had already established a mutual aid agreement with the local police and police department of Blacksburg. They regularly trained together, including an active shooter training session that took place shortly before that mass shooting. That is an incredible case study for the value of simulation training for mass casualty events.
All right, so we talked a little bit about the studies that you're looking for, some comparative effectiveness, and then some translational outcome research. Is there anything else that's kind of a hot topic right now for the journal?
Some of the hot topics right now, we're still getting a lot of papers addressing pandemic effects, not only how to deal with, the situations when you're in lockdown like that. But now there's this emerging area that, as a consequence of having the whole country locked down, there's this emerging area of simulation at a distance. How do we train simulation when we're not co-located in a place? So, there's a lot of effort coming out of the society on trying to be smarter about how we capitalize on that. And in fact, there's the human factors group that's looking at that and saying, the format now changes. So how do you maximize the benefits of an alternative format or minimize the potential impediments of this alternative format to maximize the training and beneficial pedagogical effects you get from that? So that's a new area that's coming out. Also, 3D printing of anatomical models and simulation pieces and simulators is now an emerging topic that didn't exist before. So we're beginning to see very, very sophisticated 3D printed models now that are being used for training. So there's a lot of that work that's going on. And we're always interested in anything that's unusual. So topics that are, we don't often see a lot of. For instance, we get a few papers on augmented reality, but we could be interested in seeing more of them. Crowdsourcing. How do we capitalize on crowdsourcing, if we can, for assessment, perhaps? Neural networks. Can we use neural networks to facilitate the analysis of, huge chunks of data, whether it's, visual data or video type data? Those are all kinds of topics that would be really, cutting edge, and we ought to be doing more of. Also, unusual users. We occasionally get papers that say, how does simulation training affect laypersons? Can the layperson use a defibrillator? Somebody goes down in the airport, they're posted all around. Do they know where they are? Do they know how to take it out and use it? Home care providers. We focus a lot on, formally trained providers, but what about all the number of people that do home care provision? Even if you're just the parent of somebody or the child of somebody that needs care, none of those folks are getting simulation-based training, and they could. And of course, the patients.
Well, Mark, just when I thought my career was starting to end, now you've given me new hope. There's a new beginning. I'm jesting, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And as we talked about, we need to continue to show this work so we can get more buy-in from the funders, the hospitals, even the insurers. We didn't mention the insurers, but they have
Sure.
in the game, as well as Congress funding some of this very important medical education, healthcare research. Mark, really, really a pleasure to interview you today, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sure, absolutely. I enjoyed it, Jeff, and I look forward to seeing you at IMSH.
To our listeners, thank you for listening today. In future podcasts, we will continue to discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.